Hey guys, what is going on? So I wanted to talk about the importance of leaving reps in the tank when it comes to hypertrophy work and how this may be beneficial in terms of you getting better gains, longer sustained gains, and being able to do it without as much effort versus the high volume or, very high intensity approach of taking sets to failure and constantly pushing your limits in terms of trying to get that maximum stimulus. So I think there's a time and a place for both of these, and I think the very high stimulating, going to failure sets or going past failure sets, those have their place, and I have had a lot of benefit using that style of training. In fact, this has been my predominant way of training my accessories for years now. And so I think that has a lot of benefit in terms of actually building muscle. But I think that there is an element that we're kind of missing in terms of leaving reps in reserve in terms of how that affects your performance in the gym, for that workout, for that week, for that month, for that year, right? And so the best way that we can kind of maximize our recovery is going to be not pushing ourselves as hard in the gym. Now, when we do that, when we don't push ourselves as hard as we could, we aren't getting as good of a stimulus. And so that's where this high, going to failure, high stimulus set, it's very important, is because that's going to give you the maximum stimulus for that set. And so you can't compare these in terms of leaving a set with 2-3 reps in the tank versus going all out or going past failure. That one set is absolutely going to give a better stimulus. The question is, how much better recovery can we get by keeping reps in the tank, not only in terms of throughout our entire training program, but literally within that same workout? And so this is a question I want to ask you guys is, if you were to do a set, let's say with 100 pounds on an accessory lift, and let's say you got 12 reps was the maximum that you could do. If you went all out with 12 reps and you did an AMRAP, then the following set you did another AMRAP, and then the third set you did another AMRAP, what do you think your rep counts would be? Let's say you did 12 for the first set. Would you get 10? Would you get 9? Would you get 8? And then you did another set. After that second set, would you get 8, 7, 6? Where would you be putting that? Whereas if you were to know that you could get 12 reps and you decided to go for 10 reps or 9 reps, could you keep that same level of performance across 3 sets? And I think when we look at it from that perspective, you're getting probably 3 sets of 10 that you could do pretty comfortably, or maybe 3 sets of 9 that you could do very comfortably versus maybe 12, 9, and 6. And they average out to be around the same amount of reps with that same amount of volume, but one is going to be extremely fatiguing, and it's going to cause you to continuously get worse as you progress through that workout, versus the following, where if you're leaving, let's say, 3 reps in the tank, you can probably keep that performance with the same level of RPE throughout those 3 sets. And so your recovery is going to be dramatically better in the second scenario versus the first scenario, both in terms of that same workout, but then the entire week, the entire month, how you're progressing in the gym throughout that entire process. And so if you were doing, let's say, a tricep exercise and you went to failure and you did that, and then you went to another tricep exercise, how stimulating would those reps even be on that subsequent exercise? I mean, sure, you would get a lot of stimulation from that first set that you did in that previous one, but if your strength is down so dramatically and you can't really push those weights, is that really going to be giving you the stimulus that you need? Whereas if you were to keep a few reps, 2-3 reps in reserve for your first exercise, then you move on to, let's say, another tricep exercise, do you think that your performance would take as big of a hit as if you were to go from that, highly stimulating but highly fatiguing set? The answer is you would be able to perform much better on that subsequent exercise if you left some reps in reserve. Then you can treat that next exercise as something that can give a good amount of stimulus by leaving reps in the tank, but definitely not that maximum stimulus, but you're able to keep that performance throughout your entire workout. Then when you're done with that workout, you're probably not as spent as you were from the previous workout. And whenever you hit that same muscle group again, whether it's the next day, whether it's 2 days or 3 days or whatever it is, you're probably going to come back in the gym and perform at 100% or near 100% again, whereas you might be a little bit fatigued doing the alternative. And so how does this impact your performance across, week to week, month to month, year to year? Well, in my experience, again, I saw a lot of stimulus and a lot of growth by doing that, maximum stimulus, going to failure, going past failure, drop set, ton of volume. I saw a lot of stimulus from that, but my performance in those lifts didn't really seem to go up. I was constantly redlining how much I could do, and my performance was never really increasing, but I was getting a lot of stimulus out of the sets that I was doing, but there wasn't really a lot of progressive overload going on in those scenarios. The alternative is training in a much more strength-focused style, which is leaving reps in reserve, and then every week you can add a rep. Every week you can add, quality in terms of your, rep quality. Every week you can add 5 pounds. And so if you do that week after week after week after week, and 20 weeks later, 40 weeks later, a year later, you look and you say, oh, I was doing 100 pounds for 3 sets of 9, let's say. Well, now I'm doing 125 pounds for 3 sets of 9. Well, do you think that the target muscle in that scenario grew under those circumstances? And I think that's really kind of the point that I'm trying to make is I think strength training is really about improving your performance over time. But the reality is that when you're doing like a bench press or a squat, it's a multi-joint movement. And so a lot of that can come from improving your technique in general. A lot of that can come from the contributing efforts of all the muscle groups involved in that lift. Whereas if you're doing a single joint movement, or if you're only focusing on the triceps, you're keeping your form, really dialed in. If you see that your strength went from 100 for 3 sets of 9 to 125 for 3 sets of 9 over the course of the year, you can attribute that to actually having stronger triceps as opposed to, oh, I did that on bench press. I added 25 pounds to my bench. Did that increase the size of my triceps or my shoulders or my chest, or was it technique? Did I get better at leg drive? There's a million different elements that can come into increasing your weight on a compound lift. And so taking that same mentality of trying to keep reps in reserve, but doing it with a single joint movement, I think is really going to kind of target that muscle group. And assuming that you are increasing and you're doing progressive overload, you're going to get bigger in that target area. And so in terms of my training and how this has worked for me, I always had a lot of trouble growing my triceps. Now, sure, they were growing. I was giving them a lot of stimulus. I was taking them to failure. I was doing a lot of volume. But I found that I couldn't really do a lot of weight when it came to any of these accessory movements. And I just wasn't really progressing. I wasn't really doing progressive overload. And sure, I'd get bigger, and stronger very slowly over time. But when I started to leave reps in the tank and I started to treat these movements as if they were kind of like strength movements and I was trying to keep reps in reserve, I noticed that I was continuously increasing the weight, continuously increasing sets, having better rep quality, and my performance on an exercise like a tricep row pushdown just went up dramatically. And in line with that, I saw some of the best tricep growth of my entire life. And it was done with much easier sets, right? If I'm, taking them and I'm leaving 2-3 reps in reserve as opposed to going all out and doing a ton of volume, I think the amount of junk volume that I was accumulating on that former type of training was really not serving me. Whereas the highly stimulating, sets of leaving 2 reps in reserve, they were still stimulating enough to induce muscle growth, but they weren't so fatiguing that I couldn't keep up my performance from week to week, month to month, year to year. And so I think this has really been kind of the emphasis that I've had in my training, is to really be conscious of keeping my rep quality there, making sure that I'm targeting the muscle that I want to, but then keeping those reps and those sets in line and not pushing myself too much and just getting enough stimulus where my body can grow, but not doing too much where I can't recover from that. And then again, the way that you measure your progress, I think, as opposed to looking at muscle size, is to be like, how is my performance in the gym improving? And if you're doing a lift like a tricep row pushdown where you're really only working your triceps and you're isolating them, is it safe to say that when you add weight and you add reps to that lift, assuming your form stays the same, that muscle group is the one that's actually being, targeted and it's growing? I think that's a pretty fair assumption. Whereas when you throw in something like bench press, and there's a million different ways that you can increase your bench press, from improving your technique, improving leg drive, increasing the size of any of those prime movers in the bench press. There's so many different variables that adding 20 pounds to your bench doesn't really guarantee anything. Whereas adding 20 pounds to your tricep row pushdown, which is probably a lot harder, but that's going to result in a very, expected increase in your tricep size. And so I really think that that's kind of the way that I have changed the way that I do my hypertrophy work. And as opposed to kind of playing a guessing game and just hoping that a muscle group grows by just hammering it, which to some extent works, I think having a calculated approach and just planning on, hey, I'm improving the amount of reps, the amount of sets, the amount of weight that I'm using on this exercise, there's no way that it's not going to increase in size if you keep your reps of the same quality. And so I really think that people think of strength training as being like this reps in a reserve style, and then people think of hypertrophy training as like going all out. And that's how I kind of used to do it as well. And I really don't think that that's the best way to do it, at least not for some people. Now, here's the caveat. If you aren't familiar with how many reps in reserve you can actually go to, or, how close to failure are you actually going, because you never go to failure, you don't even know what failure feels like, you've not really consistently gone that hard in the gym. Well, if you think you're leaving 2-3 reps in reserve, but you're actually leaving 5 or 6 reps in reserve, that's really when this method is not going to work. And so somebody who thinks they're leaving 2 or 3 reps in reserve but is not going hard enough, they're going to benefit much more from going to failure. And vice versa. Somebody who's constantly going to failure, constantly redlining their body, they're going to benefit the most, I think, from, taking some of that back and leaving some reps in a reserve. So you have to be honest with yourself and look at where you're at. Did you get that muscle size from having, going to failure, pushing yourself to the max? I think you can, if you're in a plateau, you can certainly cut that back and see how that works. Or vice versa. If you are really honest with yourself and you realize that you haven't been going as hard as you can, maybe that's when you start trying to take your steps to failure and you really see where you can take that. But if you're plateaued in either area and you think you're on one side of this equation or the other, just try and flip and see what happens. And for me, it was always, again, trying to go to failure, and that worked to some extent because I'm getting highly stimulatory sets by doing that. However, I think the alternative of what I'm doing now is much more so pulling back a little bit and just focusing on progressing in weight, keeping that quality form and everything like that. So hopefully that can help some of you guys who feel like you're working as hard as you can and you're just not seeing the results that you want. It might not be that you're working not hard enough. It might be that you can actually take a step back and focus on progressing in those movements as opposed to just trying to kill yourself. So hopefully that can help some of you guys. I know it really helped me. This is the way that I've been training over the past year. Made some really good progress in the areas that I wanted to, and I'm planning to continue this. So anyway, that's all I got to say about that. I'll keep you updated, and I'll talk to you soon.